In our last lesson, we studied about Samuel's closing period of his judgeship, the last judge of Israel. He was getting old, and his two sons, Joel and Abijah, were wicked men. And so that lesson closed with Israel's request to Samuel to appoint them a king. Samuel had charged them very strictly about the kind of king he would be. He would be one that would tax them heavily, that would take care of their sons for his army, take their daughters to be perfumers and bakers, take all the best of their crops and the best of their land. He told them they would be wicked men and not righteous men. So they were choosing between the unrighteous sons of Samuel and the unrighteous kings that they would have in Israel. So they didn't have a good choice unless they stayed with the choice of God. Now in this lesson number 32, we begin the period of kings that will go all the way through 2 Chronicles. But in this period of kings, there's two divisions. The united kingdom, when there's one single kingdom and one single king, and then the divided kingdom. We'll study that later, when they divide into Judah in the south and Israel in the north. But first of all, they must have a king. They demand a king. They have to have a king. So we'll choose a king in chapter 9. Read it with me in chapter 9, verse 1, and let's look at the appointment of Saul from chapters 9 through 12. There was a Benjamite. That's one of the smaller tribes. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zerah, son of Bechorath, the son of Abisheth of Benjamin. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man, without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Now I've had that experience. I traveled with a real tall young man, 6'8", through Japan. And as we walked among those young Japanese people, I many times would be head above them. He would be head and shoulder above all of them. I never had any trouble finding him. He stood out in the crowd. And that's the way it was with Saul. Here was a he-man, a big man, able to fulfill what they wanted, lead them in battle against their people. Now some donkeys belonged to Saul's father Kish, and they were lost. And Kish said to Saul, "Take one of the servants with you and go look for the donkeys." And he looked throughout all of the district of Shalim, and throughout all the district of Shalisha, and throughout all the district of Zuph. And finally Saul said to the servant who was with him, "Come, let us go back to our father, to my father, because he's probably worrying about us now more than he was worried about the donkeys." But the servant said, "Well, before we do, there is in this town a man of God," that's Samuel, highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take, whether we ought to continue to look for the donkeys or whether we ought to go back to your father's house. Saul said, "How can we go to this man? The food in our sacks is gone. We have no gift to take to the man of God. What do we have?" And that day, when they went to ask a prophet, they carried the prophet a gift. The servant said, I've got a quarter of a shekel of silver. That's 1/4 of a day's worth. I'll give it to the man, and so that he will tell us which way to take. Formerly in Israel, if a man went to inquire of God, he'd say, "Let's go to the seer," because the prophet of today used to be called a seer. And so Saul said, "Good, let's go." So they go to Samuel, and as they enter the town, they ask in verse 11, "Is the seer here?" "Yes, he's here. He's ahead of you. You need to hurry, because he's come to our town today, because the people have a sacrifice to offer at the high place. As soon as you enter town, you'll find him before he goes to the high place to eat. The people will not begin eating till he comes." So they went to town. Entering it, there was Samuel coming toward them. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, "About this time tomorrow," this is in verse 16, "about this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him leader over my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. I've looked upon my people, for their cry has reached me." Since Samuel was now old, his sons wicked, God had allowed the Philistines again to take over control of Israel. And he's choosing Saul to deliver them from the Philistine oppression. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said, "This is the man I spoke about. This is the man you anoint to govern my people." When Saul approached Samuel in the gateway, he said, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" He said, "I'm the seer. Go ahead of me to the high place, and I will tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys, don't worry about them. They've been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned? Is it not to you and all your family?" What's Saul's answer? I like Saul at the beginning of this story. He's not only a big man, he's an humble man. Saul answered, verse 21 of chapter 9, "But am I not a Benjamite, from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" Notice he didn't say, "And am I not least in all of my clan or in all of my family?" Because humble men don't lie. And he was not the least. He was the biggest and the best and the greatest in his tribe. But he says, "My tribe is the smallest tribe in all of the nation. My clan, the smallest clan in all the tribe. How can you say that I am to be king?" But that's what qualified him, right? Didn't Jesus, with his very first public words, say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they possess the kingdom of God"? Doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter the size of the man. What determines it is the smallness of his attitude toward himself. And Saul has a big body and a small ego. Then Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Samuel said, "Bring me the piece of meat." When the cook brought the leg, he says, "Here's what's been kept for you, eat. For this is the occasion that I've talked about. I've invited my guest." And Saul dined with Samuel that day. When nighttime came, they went up on the roof. And about daybreak, he talked with him all night long. And about daybreak, Samuel said to Saul, "Get ready, and I'll send you on your way." When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went outside together. As they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servants to go on ahead of us." And the servants did so. "But you stay here a while, for I have a message from God." That's chapter 9. In chapter 10, Saul is going to be anointed privately. Now later on, he'll be recognized publicly. But he's anointed first of all with nobody there but Samuel. Chapter 10, verse 1. All the servants have gone ahead. Samuel is standing here talking to Saul. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him and said, Has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance, over his people? That's his inheritance. When you leave me today, you'll meet two men near Rachel's tomb. Now he's going to give Saul some evidence that this is true. When you leave me today, you'll meet two men near Rachel's tomb. They will say to you, the donkeys you set out to look for have been found. And now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He's asking, what shall I do about my son? That's the first sign. Not three men, two men. And here's exactly what they'll say. Then you'll go on from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. Now we know where Mount Tabor is, so that's the great tree at the bottom of Mount Tabor. Three men, not two this time, three men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. So that'll be the second sign. Third sign. After that, you'll go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you'll meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place with lyres, tambourines, flutes, and harps being played before them. They will be prophesying. Now, verse 6. The Spirit of the Lord will come upon you. What had been the secret of all the judges' victory? It had been the Spirit of the Lord coming upon them. What's going to be the secret of Saul's victory? The Spirit of the Lord will come upon you in power, and you will prophesy with them. You'll be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, all 3 of them, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. He said, if these three signs come to pass, then you can be assured that from that time on, all that you do will be blessed by God. Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to offer sacrifice, to offer burnt offerings, to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. But you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do. So Saul has been privately anointed by God. I know by Samuel, but privately anointed by God to be the leader, to be the king. He looks like a king. He walks like a king. He even thinks like a king. He's humble, and he wants to give God the credit for what he does. I wish he had stayed that way. But let's continue our story. In chapter 10, verse 9, Saul turned to leave Samuel. As Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart. And all these signs were fulfilled that day. When they arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, and he joined in their prophesying. When all those who had formerly known him saw him prophesying with the prophets, they asked one another, what is this that has happened to Saul, son of Kish? Is Saul among the prophets? See, God is now wanting Israel to recognize their king. They need a king, they say. He's going to give them a king, but they must know it's Saul. A man who lived there answered, and who is their father? So it became a saying, is Saul among the prophets? After Saul stopped prophesying, he went to the high place. And Saul's uncle asked him and his servant, where have you been? Looking for donkeys, he said. But when we saw they were not to be found, we went to Samuel. Saul's uncle said, tell me what Samuel said to you. He assured me that the donkeys had been found, but he did not tell his uncle what Samuel had said about the kingdom. Still an humble man. Still not boasting about the fact that he is to be king of all the people. Samuel arrives. He will tell the people. Notice verse 17, chapter 10. He will tell the people. Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, this is what the Lord, Jehovah, the God of Israel says. I brought Israel up out of Egypt. I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God who saves you out of all your calamities, and you have said to him, no, you set a king over us. So now present yourself before the Lord by your tribes and clans. He still tells them, you're going to have the king you want, but it is not what God wants. They have one more chance to say no to their decree. They say no to God, but to say no to their desire. They have one more chance to be led by God and not by man. Now, it's a good man they're choosing, that God has chosen. A big man, a powerful man, an humble man. But this is not the desire of God, because they've rejected God as being their ruler. Again, we need to be careful what we want, for in the final analysis, God will give us what we want. We need to want the Lord God to reign over us. Verse 20, chapter 10. When Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. They're making a selection, perhaps by casting lots. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan. Matthias' clan was chosen. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen. There is the power, the hand of God. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. There's his humility again. I mean, he knows he's going to be chosen. Why isn't he there? He does not want, at this time, he does not want to be king. I wish he would have continued with that thought. For the best ruler is always the one that doesn't want to be ruler, that accepts it as an assignment and not as a political position. So they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he's hidden himself among the baggage. They ran and brought him out. And as he stood among the people, he was head taller than any of the people. Samuel said to the people, do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people. Then the people shouted, "Long live the king!" Boy, he looked like a king. Wasn't some ruddy kid like David will be. Here's a fellow who looks like he can take on Goliath, take on the giant, take on any of the enemies of God. This is the king we were looking for. Long live the king. Verse 25. Samuel explained to the people the regulations of the kingdom. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited them before the Lord. The regulation of the kingdoms is this idea that he told them before. What kind of king they would have, that would take their sons for his army, their daughters to be his servants and his cooks and his bakers and his perfume makers, and take their lands and take their crops and make them poor. He wrote all that down and he laid it out before the people. The people still could say no to their desire to have a king, but they didn't. So Samuel dismissed the people, and each one went to his own house. Not everybody, however, had accepted Saul. Look at verse 26 and 27 of chapter 10. Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose heart God had touched. That will be his inner army, his personal guard. But the Hebrew language says, this version says some troublemakers. The Hebrew language says, but some worthless men. Some men worth absolutely nothing. Said, how can this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no gifts. The text says, but Saul kept silent. The Hebrew language has some humor in it. But Saul pretended as if he were deaf. When worthless fellows speak, what do? You act like you're deaf. A worthless person's accusation is worth exactly what he's worth. Nothing. And so Saul plays like he's deaf. But now he has not everybody in the land accepting him as king. And so the first war that he fights must be one where these people recognize him as being king. And that's the Ammonite War in chapter 11. The Ammonites, if you remember, were people who came from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his youngest daughter, They're fighting against one of the cities that belongs to Saul. And so I read in verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. Here's the secret of Saul's victory. He said, you go tell the men of Jabesh Gilead that I'll be there tomorrow to deliver you. And so Saul marched all night long and separated his men into 3 divisions in the last watch of the night. And early in the morning, he'd been studying Joshua's battle plan. Early in the morning, those 3 companies attacked the Ammonites and slaughtered them. And those that survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. I don't know if that's literal or if that's an idiom. Either way, they're put in such holy fear that they flee in a totally disorganized way. If literal, not any 2 of them. Everybody flees by himself. There's absolutely no union there. And they bring Saul to Samuel and said, where's these fellows that said shall Saul reign over us? Bring them here so we can put them to death. And Saul says, nobody's going to be put to death. For this day the Lord has rescued Israel. Had he kept that thought, had he memorized that sentence, he would have been all right all the days of his life. So now all of Israel, every person recognizes the fact that Saul is king. So this first war, the Ammonite War, we're going to study 7 wars of Saul very quickly. This first war, the Ammonite War, strengthened him as king. I wish I could stop right there. Chapter 12 is Samuel's farewell speech. Chapter 13 is Samuel's rebuke of Saul because of the fact that he has not fought the way that he should. Chapter 13 is also the first Philistine war. And this war is going to cause Saul's house to be rejected. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with in verse 5 of chapter 13, with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand upon the seashore. Their situation is critical. Saul is waiting at Gilgal for Samuel. He waits 7 days, but Samuel doesn't come. And so Saul offers the sacrifice. He's no more through offering the sacrifice, and Samuel comes upon him and says, "Why have you offered this sacrifice?" He said, "I waited for you, and you didn't get here at the time appointed, and the people were scattering from me. I had to do it." He violated the will and the law of God in order to keep himself surrounded by the army. He trusted himself and his army, and he did not trust God. He violated the law and the will of God. Samuel said, "You've acted foolishly." He said, "Had you kept the law and waited for me, your kingdom would have been made steadfast and would have endured. But because you've sinned, the Lord has your kingdom will not endure, and the Lord has chosen a man after his own heart and has anointed him." Now that hadn't taken place yet, but it will. "Appointed him leader of his people, because you've not kept the Lord's command." And then Samuel left Gilgal, and Saul went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and he counted the men who were with him, 600 men. Can you not see Saul's perplexity? He now has 600 men in his army against 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Now, Saul had a son named Jonathan, and Jonathan goes up to a Philistine garrison at Michmash. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to cry up there, and if they say, 'Come up here and fight,' then that'll be the sign that God has delivered them into our hands. If they say, 'Stay there and we'll show you a thing or two,' then that'll be the sign that God has delivered them into our hands." Jonathan just believes that God has delivered them to his hand. So he calls up to the Philistine camp, and the Philistines say in verse 12 of chapter 14, "Come to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me." And he climbed up, using his hands and his feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan. I don't know what he's hitting them with, because the armor bearer has the sword. He's hitting them maybe with a stick. But those Philistines are falling on both sides of him, and his armor bearer followed and killed them behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in the area of about half an acre. That threw panic in the Philistine host. And they began to, it was a panic sent by God. And they began to flee, and Saul's men began to kill them. And they were chasing them, and the war was going well. And they said, Saul says, "We've got to fight as long as this day goes. We must defeat them today. If anybody eats anything, then they will have to die at my hand." Jonathan sees some honey on the ground, and he puts his spear into the honey and tastes the honey, and his strength is renewed, and he fights harder. But that day it was told Saul, "Somebody's eaten." And Saul says, "Whoever it is must die." They cast lots. The lots fell on Jonathan. He said, "Jonathan, you'll have to die." People said, "No, we're not going to let you kill Jonathan, because Jonathan has brought us victory this day." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Saul cannot even have his commands fulfilled. Then there's 3 quick wars: the Moabite war, the Edomite war, and the Syrian war. He has taken all of the land east of the Jordan. He's taken the land south of the Dead Sea. He's taken the land in the middle between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. But in chapter 15, he fights a war with the Amalekites. You remember them? In our Exodus from Egypt, those were the ones that Joshua had met and had gone on, and God says later on, we'll take care of these people. God told Saul, "I want you to go against the Amalekites, and I want you to kill man, woman, and child. I don't want anybody preserved." But instead of doing that, he brought Agag, the king, back, and the women back, and the cattle back, and all the good things back. They only destroyed the shameful things, the things they didn't want. When Samuel came to the camp, Saul said, "We've won a great victory for God. I did what God said." He said, "What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep I hear, and this lowing of the oxen?" He said, "All the people." The people. Said, "I tried, but the people." He says, "Because you've done this, I reject you from being king. You are no longer king. I've already rejected your house. Now I reject you from being king. I have among you the one that will be king over all of my people." In chapters 16 and 18, they fight a second Philistine war. And this war will end the Philistine control of Israel. And David has been playing his harp before Saul and easing his heart. And so Saul sends him to battle, David, the son of Jesse. He sends him to battle against the Philistines. God routs the Philistines by David's hand. And it was a victory, the lack of which they had not seen since Samson's day. I mean, the Philistines fell before David as they'd fallen before Samson. When David comes back into the camp, the people are singing, Saul has slain his thousands. And you can see Saul real proud, thousands being attributed to him. But then they say, but David, his tens of thousands. He said, what will they give David? Saul says, what will they give David now? More than the kingdom. Saul knows somebody is going to get the kingdom. And here's a man the people are honoring above him. And so Saul is now very, very suspicious that this young, ruddy lad, who's one of his generals, one of his captains, who has defeated the Philistines, is the very one who will take his throne. And he begins to eye David jealously from that time forward. In the Ammonite war, he was strengthened as king. In the first Philistine war, his house was rejected. In the Amalekite war, he himself was rejected. In the second Philistine war, it's becoming clear to him the one that God has accepted, David. And from that day forward, he begins to plot how to kill David. We'll study that next time, as he will chase David through 16 stations in an attempt to kill him. God be with you until that time.